Manufacturing Matters is an MFG Radio Network production brought to you by GIE Media's Manufacturing Group as industry experts take deep dives into the latest manufacturing matters, whether it's new innovations, products, technologies, and emerging markets that help you understand better why manufacturing matters to you and also to the top companies in the medical, aerospace, defense, and electric vehicle manufacturing industries. Hello and welcome to the latest discussion from GIE Media's Manufacturing Group titled CUI Crash Course, Practical Insights for Service Providers and Contractors. I'm Jake Kaufman, the Senior Editor for the group here at GIE Media. We're happy to be joined today by Robert McVeigh, Senior Consultant for Information Security Services at Smithers, and also Heather Siemens, the CEO at iFortress. We'd like to send a massive thank you to today's sponsor, Smithers Information Security Services. Smithers Information Security Services is a part of Smithers Quality Assessments. They offer assessments against the ISO 27001 and NIST SP 800-171 standards. Smithers will serve as a CMMC third-party assessor organization once the CMMC 2.0 is finalized. And make sure that you pay attention because there will be a short quiz at the end of the presentation. However, without any further ado, Robert and Heather, the floor is all yours. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, thanks, Jake.
My name is Heather Siemens. I'm the CEO of iFortress. We are a cybersecurity compliance and MSSP provider in the DoD space. Go ahead, Robert.
And I'm Robert McVeigh, retired military officer with acquisition and cybersecurity experience. Joined Smithers back in 2021. Smithers is one of the more recently authorized C3PAOs. And we bring about actually, this is our 100th anniversary at Smithers doing quality assessments across multiple standards, multiple industries. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is just a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing. So we're going to be talking about, first of all, some definitions. Then we're going to get into CUI and SPD. SPD is security protection data that comes from a security protection asset. CUI and ESPs. ESPs are external service providers. Lots of acronyms, I know. You guys are going to love it. External service providers are different from cloud service providers. So that is our next topic is the CUI and CSPs. And then we'll just touch on CUI and VDI, which is virtual desktop interface. Then the quiz and some questions. Next slide, please. So controlled unclassified information is defined by 32 CFR as information the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses on behalf of the government that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency to handle using safeguarding or dissemination controls. SPD is data stored or processed by a security protection asset that are used to protect an OSC's assessed environment. SPD is security relevant information that includes, but isn't limited to, configuration data that's required to operate an SPA, log files generated by or ingested by an SPA, data related to the configuration or vulnerability status of in-scope assets, and passwords that grant access in this in-scope environment. So Robert's going to go into some other definitions, but my perspective on this, and you'll see this as I go through the slides, is going to be from an MSSP standpoint, whereas Robert's is going to be from an assessor standpoint. Go ahead, Robert.
Next slide, please. So there's two types of service providers that we have to be mindful of as we go into CMMC and CUI. First is the external service providers. These would be your MSPs, your MSSPs, and it's those organizations that are helping you maintain, manage, or monitor your systems. There's a caveat to that is that if they have access to your CUI on your systems, those components that they deliver to you are in scope. And if they actually store your CUI or process your CUI on their systems, then they're fully in scope. Now, the other type of service provider is the cloud service provider. Think of this as your Microsofts, your Googles, etc., that actually you do everything up on their systems. If they are processing, transmitting, and storing your CUI in a cloud provider service like that, there are very special rules around what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. But more importantly, they have to have a FedRAMP moderate authorization or an equivalent assessment against their FedRAMP. So we'll talk a little bit more about those as we get into the discussion. Next slide, please.
So CUI and SPD. Security protection data can be created or used by security protection asset. So why do we care about this? Because SPD should be protected the same as CUI. So when we talk about SPD, that can be aggregation logs in the SIEM, and that is a huge example, and that is considered an SPA, and it will be part of the assessment scope. So here's just a few examples for different asset types. So people, consultants, managed service providers, our SPAs, enterprise network administrators. If we're talking about technology, those are going to be cloud-based security solutions, VPN services, SIEM solutions. And then if we're talking about facilities, you're talking co-located data centers, SOCs, your security operations center, and then an OSA building, office building. But I want to point out here that SIEM logs are typically available in hot storage for some period of time as part of the SIEM deployment. And in this case, the SPDs will be located in SPA. Cold storage for logs for a longer period of time can be offsite or on cloud storage. And the method and location of the cloud storage are also in the OSA's assessment scope. So you have to really look at the way your SIEM is set up and deployed. And then also, as part of that, from an MSSP standpoint, also consider your security operations center. Next slide, please. So an MSP is considered an ESP as long as they're not a CSP. I know, like clear as mud, right? So typically an MSP provides like administrative backup, maintenance services, things like that, and often operates the SOC, the Security Operations Center, as part of their contract with the OSA. So SPAs under this model of responsibility include you have to document the shared responsibility matrix, or we're now calling it the customer responsibility matrix. You have to document the SPAs in the asset inventory. It has to be in the SSP, the security system security plan, in the network diagram as well. And you have to be prepared to have this assessed against CMMC level 2. Next slide, please. So this is where it gets a little hairy. So when an ESP processes, stores, or transmits CUI, so it would be CUI with or without security protection data, it's considered a cloud service provider. If you're using a cloud service provider as your ESP, that cloud service provider has to be FedRAMP. If you're not using a cloud service provider, the services provided by the ESP are in the assessment scope and need to be assessed as part of the assessment. When the ESP stores or transmits SPD, security protection data without CUI, if the ESP is a cloud service provider, the services provided by the CSP are in the OSA's assessment scope and shall be assessed as SPAs. And if it's not a cloud service provider, the services provided by the ESP are in the assessment scope and also assessed as security protection assets. So as you can see, it's pretty much the same on that one. If the ESP processor, stores, or transmits neither CUI nor SPD, then the cloud service provider is not an ESP for the purposes of CMMC. And if it's not a cloud service provider, if it doesn't store CUI or SPD and doesn't meet the definition of an ESP, so you don't have to worry about it there. So this comes straight from the ESP scoping requirements from the DoD. So this table is very key to understanding what roles and who fits into what and what data fits into each service provider.
Let me chime in for just a second there, Heather, on some of these conversations. As your assessor, since C3PAOs are what we're doing and looking at these, we're going to have the conversation with you early on. A couple of things we're going to ask you when we start with an assessment planning for an organization is, do you have SPD? Do you have SPAs? Partially, we're asking that question because the more things that you can take out of scope by limiting who can access the data, who can see the CUI, the easier assessment becomes, number one. Number two, it also places the CUI at a lesser risk. So the importance of this slide, like Heather talked about here, is really to determine where your data is actually being processed, transmitted, and stored. And that's going to be the trail that your assessor is going to follow. To be really blunt with you, if you have a cloud service provider and they are processing, transmitting, or storing your CUI in their system, something like you use in Microsoft Office and you email a CUI, or you're storing the CUI in Teams or SharePoint, by automatic virtue of doing that, that organization is considered a cloud service provider, and all that data and their FedRAMP authorization, whether it's an authorization or an equivalent, is in scope. If you do not process CUI through those organizations and you do not put the data up into the cloud service provider, then you can start pulling them a little bit out of scope. The big concern in this space is around external service providers, because external service providers often are MSPs and MSSPs who are managing, handling your data for you. They have administrative rights to your systems. They can log in remotely to your systems. They update systems. Smithers does the same. We actually have an MSP that manages our Azure Gov GCC High environment. So as a result, my MSP is in scope of the assessment, but they're only in scope for what they do because they don't actually store or process or transmit my CUI. They just have access to it on our systems. So that's kind of a nuance about where you drop them in. There are some ESPs that actually put your data onto their systems and allow you to transact the data from them. They have full access. That brings them much closer to that CSP discussion. And so as a result, the whole organization would be in scope. And that's where we start talking about either they need their own level 2 certification, or during the assessment, we have to double the scope as an assessor and say, okay, company company ABC, you've got the data, but you're using MSP XYZ. By the way, that MSP, all 110 controls are in play for them because you're actually storing your data on their system. Ideally, you would not want to store your data on your ESP or ESP system, because that keeps them not completely out of scope, but a little bit at arm's length.
Yeah, and I will say this, as a MSSP, we try to obviously touch as little CUI. We try not to touch any CUI, but we try to touch as little SPD as we can. But we always, no matter how we're set up, we are there on site at the assessment for our clients. So it's really important to have, if your MSSP is doing SOC SIM for you, they need to show up to your assessment, because they're going to be asked questions. You're going to be asked questions that you can't provide, that your ESP is going to have to, your MSSP is going to have to provide, or they need to be there. So,
but let me offer a caveat to that. As C3PAOs start going through the ISO 17020 accreditation process, while yes, you can have your MSP and MSSP, ESP be there and provide information, it is the responsibility of the organization undergoing certification assessment. It is their responsibility to know how the data is being processed, transmitted, and stored. So while you may ask your MSP to address the specific control being implemented, if the MSP is driving the assessment, that tells your assessor that the organization doesn't understand what they're processing and they've kind of outsourced it. And that's kind of a no-go. Because remember, the organization even is ultimately responsible for the protection of the CUI. Doesn't matter what the ESP or MSP or MSSP or CSP, a lot of acronyms, doesn't matter what any of them say. At the end of the day, The organization seeking certification bears the responsibility of understanding how their data is protected. Which kind of gets us to the next slide. Simple answer on this one. We just talked a little bit about this. If your CUI is processed, transmitted, or stored in a cloud solution, the CFR rule, the CFR rule is very, very clear in that it states that if you're using a cloud service provider, whether you're an ESP or not an ESP, you are subject to being FedRAMP moderate authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. Now, a lot of organizations are running around with the FedRAMP moderate equivalent. They're saying this is a great thing. There's only one problem with the FedRAMP moderate equivalent package. When we get a FedRAMP moderate equivalent package as a C3PAO, first off, you have to have evaluated your CSP's body of evidence. And there's an actual memorandum issued by the DoD that specifies what that body of evidence should look like. You, the organization seeking certification, are responsible for reviewing that package, understanding the vulnerabilities of what that moderate equivalent means. Now, if they're authorized, that's an entirely different discussion. We'll talk about that in a second. But if it's an equivalent package, you have to review it. You have to accept it. You actually have to put it into your risk matrix that it's a risk because it's a body of evidence. Your C3PAO for level 2s, and if the DIBCAC is coming in for a level 3, we are also going to require access to that BOE. A little bit of a challenge because a lot of times organizations make you sign non-disclosures on the BOE, and they say, well, we'll have to get it. Okay, your C3PAO and your DIBCAC are not going to seek a non-disclosure for the release of that information. So you need to get your CSP or ESP who's handling it for the FedRAMP equivalent. You need to get them to understand you've got to provide that information to your assessor because ultimately, again, it's back to the OSC bears the responsibility of providing that information, and not only that, but understanding that information when they present it to the assessor, whether it's a C3PAO assessor or it's the DIBCAC.
I will say this, as you go through your shared responsibility matrix, you're going to realize you're not going to be able to inherit everything. A lot of people think, oh, well, as long as, and we can get into, Robert will get into inheritance in a minute, but going through just the exercise of going through that shared responsibility matrix, you will definitely understand better what the responsibilities are of you, of your ESP, of your CSP, and what you can inherit and what you can't.
Right. There are significant controls that you cannot inherit from your MSP, ESP, or CSP, specifically around your hiring process, your provisioning process, your training, your risk assessment. Those all belong to the organization. So
Yeah.
please be
Physical security, things
yeah,
like that.
be very cautious when somebody says our documentation package or our service will meet 100% of the CMMC CUI controls. There is no possibility that an inheritance from an outside organization can meet it because there are whole components of the C3PAO inspection of the CMMC organization that require us to look at your internal processes. Now, there's a significant amount on the technical side that your ESP can provide to you, but a full inheritance of every one of the 110 controls, 320 assessment objectives is just not physically possible. All right, next slide, please. Let's dig a little bit further. The question here is my ESP a CSP? We've tapped danced on that a little bit. What we want to give you is some actual case and examples of looking at organization. So short answer is, is the company marketing itself as a cloud service provider? Do they say X as a service for their capabilities? Are they on a subscription base? Can they, and what you're really looking for a CSP is, do they have that ability to rapidly provision and change the system within your system? So like if you're, Microsoft Azure, you jump in. Microsoft Azure is a perfect example of platform and infrastructure and platform infrastructure as a service. They are a CSP by their very definition, because of what they do, how they organize, how you can provision quickly, how you can change it. But more importantly, you're hosting your data in their environment. If you have Office 365, if you have one of the O365s and it's not a local Exchange version or a local platform version, then your data is in a cloud service provider. The short answer there is that if you don't need to use the Office tools for processing, transmitting, or storing the CUI, as a C3PAO, I would recommend avoid that, because Once you bring them into play, then they become cloud service provider. You have to have their authorization packet, and your risk profile has to accommodate them. The easiest answer is that you keep your ESP out of that space and you don't allow your ESP to process, transmit, or store the data on their systems. As long as they're storing it on your systems and they have administrative rights to your systems, that's an acceptable ESP relationship that doesn't force us to have to look at the ESP and conduct an assessment against them. Now, the problem comes in, this is why we have the gray area. The problem comes in is that depending on how the ESP is written, their customer responsibility matrix, or some call it a shared responsibility matrix, depending on how it's written, it can actually imply that the data is stored on their system. And so you want to be very careful as you're reviewing that CRM or SRM with your ESP to make sure that the delineation of where the CUI is stored, who has the ability to process and transmit it, is clearly articulated, because that will help your assessor determine, is your ESP in scope or is your ESP out of scope? Whether it's a full assessment against your ESP or a partial assessment against your ESP. And that comes back to, what is that specific relationship between those organizations? Just telling your assessor, this is how we do it, that's interesting, but this is engineering 101, so to speak, or auditing 101. If it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So you need to ensure that the service level agreements, the CRM or SRM, are clearly articulating who's responsible for what. Ideally, your MSP or ESP will have a statement in their SLA that they will not process, transmit, or store CUI on your behalf or store it on their systems. That's a great document, great statement to have. We just got to be able to back it up with evidence that you don't move the data onto their systems. Heather, anything from the MSP perspective here?
Not on this slide, maybe the next one. I have something on the next
Great.
one.
Let's jump to the next one.
So is my MSP a CSP? So here's where things get maybe a little bit more of a clear line in the sand. You need to figure out if your MSP has a contract with a CSP and further modifies a basic cloud service, then the MSP is a CSP, and they have to meet applicable FedRAMP or equivalency requirements. So the other side of that is if you have a cloud tenant and that cloud tenant under contract is with you as the OSA between the CSP, then the MSP is not a CSP. So you have a tenant in Azure GovCloud, then as long as you have control of that, if your managed services provider walks away, then you still have control of that tenant, then the MSP is not a CSP because you have a direct relationship with the cloud service provider. But if they are the intermediate between your cloud service and you, then that MSP is going to be CSP and has to meet all the FedRAMP requirements. Do you have some stuff to add there, Robert?
Not on this one.
Okay. Next slide, please. VDI, our favorite. Go ahead, Robert.
So VDI is the easiest methodology for organizations to remove items out of scope. And virtual desktop infrastructure, pretty straightforward. However, a lot of organizations say, hey, we have VDI. And they immediately say, therefore, all the endpoints and everything's out of scope. That's not quite that simple. The VDI, depending on how it's configured, can keep a lot of systems out of scope. Because ideally, what you're trying to do is the more systems, the more endpoints that you can take out of scope means the assessor is not going to have to do a large sampling. So, if you're an organization that has 10 or 20 people, sampling your 10 or 20 computers just to make sure that they're all configured properly, the VDI is pretty straightforward. If you're a larger organization, 1, 2, 3, 4, 500 endpoints and 2, 3, 400 employees, the sampling becomes much more complicated as a C3PAO. So the more you can do to take systems out of scope, the better off you are. However, just saying, hey, I have a VDI doesn't make the endpoint out of scope. What makes the endpoint out of scope is if the VDI is configured for the processing, transmitting, and storing a CUI, but only allows keyboard, video, mouse interfaces to the client. We've seen many cases where the client says, hey, we're VDI, therefore the endpoints are out of scope. Okay, that's great. However, break, let's look at the implementation of the VDI. The VDI allows the employee to take their machine, connect to the VPN, log into the VDI, but they can download documents onto their computer, or they can pull a document out of the VDI and print it. The moment you break that seal of the keyboard, video, mouse capability only in the VDI, then that endpoint starts back into scope. If you can pull data out of the VDI and put it onto that laptop or that desktop, that means that desktop is processing, transmitting, storing CUI. That desktop is now fully back in scope. If you pull it down, if you have the ability to pull it down and send it to a printer, well, guess what you just did? You just made that platform, the network that it connects through, and the printer back in scope, because all of them are processing, transmitting, or storing CUI. So be very cautious when an organization approaches you and says, hey, we have a complete VDI solution. It does everything you need, keeps all your endpoints out of scope. That can be true. The bottom comment here is if it's not properly configured to prevent the processing, they get treated as CUI assets. So ask that question. Now, that doesn't mean that a VDI solution that allows limited printing or limiting transmission to the platform to be minimal, that actually is a good thing, because what it makes sure is that the end-to-end connection between that endpoint and the network that's storing the CUI is well secured and well protected. And that's really kind of where you want to be in the space. So I'm not saying VDI solutions are not a good use, just you need to understand the risk of how it's being implemented, and then have the compensating controls that says, hey, we're going to allow printing, or we're going to allow somebody to put, documents, pull it off the document, work on their local machine. That's fine. That makes the local machine in scope, and it just means you have to implement the proper security controls on that system. Doesn't by any stretch of the imagination say the VDI is not a good solution. Smithers, we do use a VDI solution, and we don't allow the printing, and we don't allow the local storage. So that helps keep our endpoints out of scope. At some point in the future, we may have to change that, in which case we'd have to revisit our entire risk posture to see what's the right answer here. Heather, any concerns from an MSP on implementing a VDI?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Perfect. All right, as we promised, as Jake said earlier, there is a quiz. We want to see how well we did in presenting the information to you, number one. And number two, this will be kind of a feeder for follow-on questions.
Awesome. So we will launch the first question then for the audience now, and just answer it to the best of your abilities. And then we'll have Robert and Heather kind of break down each of the answers then. So the first question, is my company out of compliance if our CUI resides in our MSSP's enclave solution that is not FedRAMP authorized or equivalent? Give the audience a few moments to answer that. Okay, I think we probably end the questions now, and we'll see what the answers. You share the results there. Pulling those back up. Okay. So it looks like 81% of the answers say yes, that the company would be out of compliance. So
Yep.
Heather and Robert, how'd they do?
Yes, they did good. Yes.
Yeah, yes is the right answer. Because those assets because you are storing data on the MSSP's enclave, that automatically places them in scope, which means that if they are not FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP equivalent, goes back to that chart, a couple charts back, the one that's the direct lift. Actually, could you go back 3 charts, please?
7. I think it's 7.
One more.
If you have an MSP that comes to you and tells you they have an enclave solution, the first question you need to ask them is, are you FedRAMP?
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, when we show up as your assessor, we're going to ask you the very same question. So as an assessor, when we do either the pre-assessment or we do the phase 1, we're going to ask you for that. And if you tell us that you've got an ESP that is processing, transmitting, and storing your CUI, we're going to say, great, do you have the body of evidence for their CSP, FedRAMP equivalent, or do they have a FedRAMP authorization? If you say no to either one of those, at least at Smithers, we will stop the assessment. We won't go any further because at that point, there is no chance that we can provide a certification for that organization. Can we hit the next one, Jake?
Yes, we can get to the next question then in the quiz here. As if we ask the audience, our MSP remotely assesses our on-premises and cloud environments. CUI is stored in both environments. Does the MSP require a CMMC certification? Okay, got some results coming in. Give them a few more seconds here to put in their answers. We thank the audience for their participation in this quiz. Okay, let's see how you guys did. How good did you pay attention? 89% say yes, that the MSP would require a CMMC certification.
So you want the good news or the bad news? So the good news is bad news is those who said yes, they require certification actually is not true. An organization that is remotely accessing your on-prem or cloud environments for you is not required to have their own CMMC certification. The component, and it goes back to this slide right here, those components of their customer responsibility or shared responsibility matrix where they're accessing or administering your CUI data is in scope for the assessment. The MSP does not have to have its own CMMC certification. The 32 CFR does recommend that they have their own certification, but it is not mandatory as long as the CRM can be documented and they can provide the evidence to demonstrate that their own internal processes for accessing your system, accessing your environment are secure and that they follow, the personnel training processes, the personnel employment processes. So only those components of the SRM or CRM are in scope for the assessment.
So then what would the good news there be, Robert?
Well, that's the good news is they don't have to have their own
Yeah.
CMMC certification because that can be for a MSP, that can be a fairly large outlay of time and capital because it is such a broad capability. And more importantly, we would not want to have to conduct an assessment against the MSP every single time we come to do an assessment for them.
If you take anything away from this presentation, this slide is what the CUI and ESP slide is what you need to refer to because it helps a lot.
Awesome. So we'll go to the next question in the quiz. So the audience, we ask you, we store CUI in the cloud and our MSP administrators or administers the environment. Is the MSP a CSP? We do have some results coming in now. Just looking at the early results, it seems like there is a little bit of hesitation from the audience on this one. So hopefully Robert and Heather are able to kind of explain this one because it does appear to be a toss-up. We'll give the results now. As you can see, it is a straight 50-50 split as to whether this is a yes or a no answer. So like I said, it was a dead heat between the two.
So to go to Heather's earlier comment, come back to this chart. Short answer on this chart is, does the MSP store, process, or transmit your CUI on their environment? This question is, they're storing it on the OSC's environment and your MSP has access to it? So the answer here is no, the MSP is not a CSP in this case because they're not actually processing, transmitting, and storing the data on their infrastructure, their systems. It's only if they do that. Because they're administrating on behalf in your environment, So like in Smithers' case, we have our Azure Gov environment, which is listed under our name. Our GCC High licenses are under our name. Our MSP administers them for us. My MSP is not a CSP because of that, because they are not handling the data directly. They're handling it on behalf of me and our systems. Heather, how about you for implementation on your side?
Got nothing on that one.
Okay.
We just administer it. We know we don't have to be a CSP.
Awesome. So we'll go to the final question in the quiz. CUI is processed, stored, and transmitted in a virtual desktop infrastructure, also known as a VDI. Are the endpoints used to access the VDI in scope as the CUI or as CUI assets?
Can you go to slide 11 while we're waiting?
Yes, we can. We can probably move the quiz over just a little bit and get the results here. And 78% say yes, the endpoints used to access the VDI are CUI assets.
Again, it depends.
Absolutely depends.
Yeah, if you're not properly configured, if it's not properly configured and the endpoints are storing, process, or transmitting, then yes, they're going to be in scope. But if the VDI is set up correctly, all the endpoints should not be in scope. There should be no endpoints in scope if it's set up correctly. So it all depends on your configuration.
Yeah, if you have the most restrictive of VDIs, and I'll use Smithers as an example, we have the most restrictive of VDIs. Our VDI only allows keyboard, video, and mouse interface to the VDI. We're not allowed to pull documents down. We're not allowed to print documents. We're not allowed to store anything local. Everything is encapsulated in the VDI. So therefore, in my case, the VDI endpoints are not in scope. But like I talked earlier, if you allow the endpoint to download or to print or to actually pull the document out of the VDI, then the endpoint is in scope. So kind of a trick question saying yes, no, it should have been yes, no, or depends. And this really is a depends. But I will say that a lot of questions about CMMC and about compliance really do fall into the depends category. It depends on what your risk posture is. It depends on what your relationship is with your MSP, CSP, or ESP. And it depends on how you configure your systems. Ideally, most organizations, we recommend to take as much of the ESP, CSPs out of your CUI data flow chain, because the more they're out of your data flow chain, the more restricted or more enclaved your data is, the simpler the assessment is. The simpler the assessment typically means a more cost-effective assessment. The broader your data is spread, the more people who have access, the more endpoints that have access to it, the duration, scope, and expense of your assessment all start to creep up at that point. Okay, let's go to the last one. Kind of leave you on an ending question. Is we talked quite a bit about it. Our real focus today is really about the ESPs. The CSP is pretty much a straightforward thing. If you're using a CSP to process, store, transmit CUI, FedRAMP moderate equivalent or FedRAMP moderate authorized, no discussion. If you're using an ESP, that's where the discussion comes into play. The ESP has so many variations to it, so many nuances about where the data is processed, transmitted, and stored, who's doing it, on behalf of who, how is it accessed, etc. All those come into play. Now, it's not an insurmountable, but like Heather talked about, if you go back to slide 7, don't go to slide 7 here, but if you go back to that slide that has that banner that says CSP, ESP, tells you what you're looking for, that is probably the best slide that you can pull out of the 32 CFR rule to look at. Also, your C3PAO or your MSP, when they're helping you set up, should have that slide readily available to say, okay, let's talk about how your data is being handled. I'm not saying your MSP has to be part of that decision process, but if your MSP accesses your system on your behalf and helps you do protection of the CUI, you definitely want them involved in that conversation, because you both need to understand what risk you're bringing to the CUI and ultimately who has what to do. The one thing you cannot, as an organization seeking certification, the one thing you cannot do is you cannot delegate away the responsibility for protecting the CUI. You can give the accountability to somebody else, but at the end of the day, the responsibility still sits with the OSC. So your assessor is going to be asking the OSC, how are you protecting the data? What are you doing to make sure it doesn't get released out into the wild? You can have all the MSPs and CSPs in the world you want, but at the end of the day, we're asking the organization, how are you doing it?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to have an MSP that understands CUI and CMMC and has some certified people, whether it's a CCA, a CMMC certified assessor, or a CMMC certified professional. If they have some of that expertise in-house and understand, then you're going to be a lot better off. If they don't know how to spell CMMC, then you might need to find another MSP.
Great. Well, folks, that's all we had for formal. Let's go to the last slide real quick, please. At this point, we've got about 15 minutes. If there's any specific questions you'd like to throw at Heather or me, please, more than welcome. If you have, specific questions around your organization, what you're attempting to accomplish, you've got my contact and Heather's contact information. Both of us be happy to, field your questions. I will offer, though, as a certification body and as a C3PAO, Smithers can only give you general guidance. I cannot provide you specific recommendations. Heather, on the other hand, as an MSP, can give you very specific recommendations or tell you for implementation. I can give you guidance. You can call me and say, which is a better MFA solution, a Duo or Microsoft's Authenticator. I can't answer that question saying which is better. What I can do is I can tell you an MFA solution should have the following 5 things. Heather, on the other hand, can look at it from your organization's perspective and say, this would be a better solution for you based on how you're organized.
Yeah, and just I am a lead CCA and I'm also a certified information system auditor. So even though I'm not doing assessing, I do understand what they're looking for and everything. So we at iFortress also have a couple of other CCAs and CCPs to help. So give us a call if you need help and we will advise. Unlike Robert.
So I guess it's like one question that I personally have then is during the prior webinars that we've done with Robert, he has kind of talked about the backup that has happened with the amount of assessors that are available to commit these assessments. Heather, are you seeing the same thing on your end or
I see
is
it.
there plenty of people available to work on that side?
There's not plenty of people
No.
to do assessing. Yeah, there's a definite shortage I see everywhere. We purposely did not become a C3PAO at iFortress because our specialty is doing the advisory and setting them up and putting all the puzzle pieces together because it is very complicated. And because we're an MSSP, also it's very important for ongoing compliance to have an MSSP that can do that because there's certain things that have to be done monthly, quarterly, and annually as part of the requirements for CMMC level 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, there's a shortage.
Gotcha. So
We're
Albert wants
growing our CCAs internally.
The ecosystem is still incredibly challenged. There's only 77 C3PAOs. Those are the organizations that are authorized to conduct the assessments and issue certificates. And there's only, as of last night, there's only 459 assessors. So if you take that 70,000 potential contractors who need assessments and you divide that by 77 of us who can do the assessments, and then further divide that by 450 assessors,
Yeah.
keep in mind that every assessment has to have a lead CCA, a CCA, and a CCA doing quality. So I have to have 3 separate people on every assessment. That math very quickly tells you the throughput is limited. So my recommendation, and it's probably the same with Heather, if CMMC is something that's on your plate that you think you want to do, that you're going to need, you probably need to be talking to, a CMMC consultancy now to figure out what that solution is going to look like, unless you have the inside technology and expertise. You also probably want to be talking to your C3PAOs, or at least figuring out which C3PAO you have. Most C3PAOs right now are booking as far as a year out because that's where it is. The other trigger, Jake, that's going to happen here very shortly is the 32 CFR rule released last year said CMMC is now mandated and go. The big one is the 48 CFR, which is the change to the DFARS rules, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. That rule is expected to release in the next couple of months. When that rule releases, that turns on the 4-year clock. And essentially what we're looking at is they'll turn it on for government fiscal year 26, which is 1 October of this year. If that turns on fiscal year 26, that means from October of this year to September next year, all organizations that handle CUI have to do a self-assessment, self-certification. However, October 1 of 26, fiscal year 27, all new contracts with the federal government or all new contracts with a supplier to the federal government will have to have a third-party assessment as a condition of award. And then 1 October of 27, all existing contracts and any contract with up for options or extensions will have to have a C3PO inspection as well. So that's the big trigger. We've got about 2 years before the ecosystem is going to be really stretched hard, which is why we're trying to get to organizations saying, look, if you have the bandwidth now, you might want to reach out to your CCA, your CMMC consultants and your CMMC CPOs, start getting those conversations on the table.
Awesome. Looks like Susan in the audience wants to know if the government has begun with their audits.
So yes, now remember, the government is only doing the level 3s. The DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center, only does level 3s. To get a level 3, you've got to be in a special category and be designated by the DoD. What'll happen is you still got to go through a C3PAO like Smithers, get your level 2, and then once you have a level 2 that is 100% met controls, all 110 controls through internal are met, then you ask the DIBCAC to come in and do, I think it's 32 or 33, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's 32 or 33 additional checks. However, understand the DIBCAC does do a small amount of sampling of the 110 level 2 controls as part of it. The other area the DIBCAC does what's called a SPURS verification. So you go into SPURS doing your self-assessment or even your C3PO assessment, you enter a score. The DIBCAC has the authority to call you and say, hey, we're going to do a SPURS validation, which in case that they'll come down, if it's a level 2, they will inspect your entire level 2 package to say, are you truly level 2? So if you're in that self-assessment window, be very judicious, very cautious about reporting a 110. If you're not 100% confident, you can back it up with documentation. Because if you get picked for a DIBCAC SPURS verification and you can't demonstrate it, you are toying with that False Claims Act component of the SPURS system. So just be very careful.
And they are doing false claims acts now.
Yes.
Awesome. We also have Albert in the audience who wants you guys to know that he has an external provider overseeing security patches and managing domain controllers. So they do have elevated access rights. Is that a problem since they are not part of their organization?
Well, it's not a problem, but they have to be, that is a person that touches SPD potentially. So their roles and responsibilities have to be showed up in a RACI matrix and or the shared responsibility matrix. So depending on, if it's just security patch, I mean, it's again, it's a depends thing. But they are touching SPD, yes, they have to be, they're going to be in scope as a user, as an administrator. They will be in scope.
And then another question I have, in theory, with manufacturing coming back to the United States, would this have more traffic then coming into the defense contracting and getting the CMMC certification? Or since most defense contractors already have that certification, regardless of where they are in the world, would that not really, increase the amount of traffic that you guys would be seeing?
Well, that's a hard one. Again, that depends. It depends on how the contract is awarded. What I would say is that CMMC and its use is applicable to any DoD contract, regardless of the location of the vendor, if the contract contains CUI. And the requirement is the flow down. There is no US specific component of CMMC that is out there. Basically says any DoD contract or subcontract that's a provider to the DoD prime contract that has CUI, all the vendors, the prime and all their associated vendors, as far down in the infrastructure as it goes, who provide or have access to CUI have to have a CMMC certification. The only caveat to that is that everything we do for CMMC and all the results have to be reported in English. So, if you're a German firm and you're providing, systems to the US government under a CUI contract, you would have to provide that information, and your assessor would have to provide the information in English. You could keep a German version, but everything has to be documented in English to go into the government system. But I would offer that if you're on a DoD contract, the DoD contracts all have a requirement that all documentation, all contract information is submitted in English regardless. So I don't think there's going to be a big shift as they come back to the United States, because if they're doing it in a foreign country, they're still going to have to do it in the United States. It doesn't matter.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought, but just to have an actual expert say it instead of me, with my, little peanut brain, definitely makes me feel better. Awesome. So looks like that does answer about all the questions we have from the audience. So obviously we want to say a massive thank you to Smithers Informational Security Services, and a massive thank you to Robert McVeigh and Heather Siemens from iFortress for your time and your expertise today. Thank you so much, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Y'all. Bye.
You can listen to all of our episodes of Manufacturing Matters and Lunch and Learn podcast from the MFG Radio Network on Spotify, Apple Music, and on our websites, todaysmedicaldevelopments.com, aerospacemanufacturinganddesign.com, defenseandmunitions.com, and evdesignandmanufacturing.com.